An ongoing problem in American higher education, particularly at the undergraduate level, is the conflict between the teaching of facts, which are promptly regurgitated on a multiple-choice machine-graded test, and between the teaching of critical thinking skills, the habit of skeptical inquiry. Students who take courses that consist primarily of the memorization of facts may fail to develop those essential critical thinking skills which are, I believe, and many believe, the essence of the well-educated individual. The truly educated and enlightened individual, the critical thinker, knows both where to find information on a topic and, more importantly, how to evaluate the truthfulness of any information he finds. The more that we learn about evidence and claims, the more we realize that truth is a slippery rascal. As someone pointed out, today, with heart-lung machines, ventilators, dialysis, pacemakers, and so forth, it's increasingly difficult to tell if a person is dead or alive. R.V. Jones, a British scientist, in his book The Wizard War, speaks of a terrible mistake made by British intelligence during World War II. Based on reports from spies on the ground in Germany, they made this kind of deduction. The spies regularly saw that automobiles would stop when a radio broadcast came out of a powerful radio tower somewhere in Germany. British intelligence made the deductive leap that the Germans had invented a machine that would stop automobile engines. British intelligence was very worried about this. Well, what they later found out was that people who entered the area where the radio transmitter was were ordered to stop their engines because the automobile engines were emitting some kind of electronic interference with the radio broadcasts. Now, this example just shows how easy it is to mistake a cause when you have an effect such as cars stopping. We encounter critical fallacies, just as Jones did, virtually every day of our lives. And by learning certain critical fallacies, we can become better critical thinkers. Perhaps the most common critical fallacy encountered in student writing is the sweeping generalization, the unqualified generalization. Advertisers love to use this fallacy. One of the most common ploys of the propagandist is called the glittering generality, which consists of glossy adjectives and vague nouns. Advertisers and politicians rely on these things tremendously. Beside me, you'll see a sign advertising for the Key West, the fabulous Shell warehouse. Well, what does fabulous mean? Well, it sounds good, but if you think of it literally, it means this is the material that fables are made out of. I've lived in Florida many, many years. I've never heard any fables about the fabulous Shell warehouse. And in fact, when I visited the Shell warehouse here in Key West just a few moments ago, I found it perhaps mildly interesting at best. I can't imagine anybody wanting to go see the mildly interesting Shell warehouse, so it becomes the fabulous Shell warehouse, the kind of experience that fables are made out of. I ask you, isn't this really fabulous?
The hasty generalization comes about because we've not looked at enough examples. If I say, for example, that I know Fords are no good because the one that I had rusted terribly, or that Fords are great because mine went 300,000 miles with no major repairs, we certainly haven't looked at adequate examples to make the generalization that Ford is either good or isn't good. In any survey of public opinion, the sample size has to be fairly large to represent the public at large. And if it's not large enough, the results will probably be inaccurate. A second cause of the hasty generalization comes from not choosing typical examples. If our examples are going to represent the class of objects as a whole, they simply must be the ones that we would likely find, not the freakish, not the atypical ones.
If, for example, our neighbor has a terrier that is very friendly to strangers, we would want to both look at more examples other than our neighbors to make sure that that terrier was not unusual or a freakish kind of mutant. If we see several mounted policemen but no others, we might think that all police ride horses. Thus, we must ascertain whether our example was freakish, not typical, and whether terriers typically are friendly to strangers, and whether the typical policeman rides a horse. If we control the sampling of a group to single out unusual examples, we can vastly distort the group. Two examples can help illustrate this very, very clearly. We've heard about the mythical grandfather who smoked 2 packs of cigarettes every day for 65 years and never had a health problem related to smoking. Was that grandfather typical? We've also heard probably about the teenager who was in a car wreck not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown clear, the car burst into flames or else landed in the river. The student lived. Was that student driver who didn't wear his seatbelt and survived the crash, was he typical? Another critical question that we have to ask is whether the information provided us, whether the claims provided us, are really relevant at all. Cigarette advertisers, for example, regularly use a kind of fallacy called the red herring, the deliberate introduction of a misleading or false or confusing line of inquiry. Since the introduction of warning labels on packages and ads, cigarette advertisers have increasingly had to red herring us away from the warning label and to introduce irrelevant claims, such as that women who smoke Virginia Slims are somehow liberated from male domination. An aspirin manufacturer several years ago used to ask whether all aspirins were just alike. Well, the advertiser never answered the question. He just bragged about how much care went into the making of his aspirin. This bagpiper presents a most unusual and really irrelevant claim. The introduction of confusing, irrelevant, misleading claims is sometimes described as card stacking. Card stacking propaganda consists of virtually any attempt by the propagandist to confuse, to mislead, to stack the cards against a consumer or against his audience so that they can't make a rational decision. And this can be done in a number of different ways. You can do it by introducing irrelevant details, by the use of scientific sounding words, by the use of misleading statistics. Behind me you will see a sign that says Key West Handprint Fashions. It's very interesting when we look at what the truth of the matter is. What exactly does handprint mean? It sounds special, but is it? Whenever we disagree with an opponent's policies, perfectly natural human tendency is to want to attack our opponent, and we do it by name-calling often. When we attack that person, it's known as the ad hominem fallacy. We should remember, however, that bad men and women can have good ideas, and unfortunately, good men and women can have bad ideas. And just because our opponent happens to be a narrow-minded, pencil-necked geek, I hope you recognize the fallacy, doesn't mean that his policy is a bad one. If you examine the editorial page of your local paper, you will probably find a great many examples of this fallacy. A certain radio commentator regularly refers to feminists as feminazis and to environmentalists as tree huggers. That disgustingly obese, opinionated right-wing chauvinist, he's guilty of name-calling. The ad hominem fallacy does not mean that we should fail to examine the credentials and the credibility of any source of testimony, because testimony is only going to be credible in relationship to the credentials and the lack of prejudice of any source of testimony.
With testimony, we will always be concerned with questions of prejudice and of reliability. If we ask a football coach, for example, whether athletics are a positive or a negative influence on the academic quality of a university, his answer will probably be prejudiced. And even if it weren't prejudiced, would the opinion of the football coach be the most reliable source in relationship to a university's overall academic excellence or lack of it?
Experience in a given field is extremely important to help a person gain credibility. But we have to remember that literally millions of people have had appendectomies and don't know a great deal about abdominal surgery. In order to have credibility in that field, you need to have both experience, probably, and academic credentials. If we've had both experience and training in appendectomies and are not prejudiced, then any testimony we might give on that topic could be fairly reliable supporting evidence. But if a surgeon can profit by advising everyone to have his appendix taken out, beware of what he says, and be sure to get a second disinterested opinion. The Japanese have recently been severely criticized because of the publication of some recent history books in which their culpability in attacking the United States in 1941 at Pearl Harbor was severely downplayed, almost not mentioned at all. Well, obviously their version of history is prejudiced in favor of the Japanese. This summer, in a museum in England, I learned that Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who negotiated with Hitler, was not the dupe of Adolf Hitler, as our history books portray him to be, but was a very, very wise politician who knew that Hitler was going to betray the treaty and only signed it in order to buy time so that England could rearm. Whose version of history is correct? I suppose it depends on the viewpoint. I recently read a book called The Secret History of the Korean War, and in that book, the Chinese, whom we always portray in our books as the aggressor nation, are portrayed there as people who are defending their property. That is, when the United Nations troops went into North Korea, they were about to attack some dams, some hydroelectric dams, which were the key to the reindustrialization of that area of China. And they were right on the border of China. So who was the aggressor in Korea? It depends upon your point of view, I suppose.
So a constant problem with testimony is the question of prejudice. Another logical problem that we have to deal with is the question of oversimplification. When we have an effect, such as inflation in the 1970s, we try to find the one cause, the only cause, when very likely there are multiple causes. Was it Arabs who raised the price of oil? Was it the failure to pay for the Vietnam War with adequate taxes? Was it interest rates being too low? Was it caused by too much government borrowing? Economists would likely say it was all of these and many more causes, not just one. When a wreck occurs, we look for one cause: alcohol, or speed, or driver error, or mechanical failure, or bad weather. All of these may have contributed to the accident. Americans are currently concerned about crime, and we look for the cause: no prayer in schools, the breakup of families, early paroles, plea bargaining, drugs, and so on. Which one is it? In the play Hamlet, the cruel King Claudius is finally killed after being forced to drink poisoned wine, being stabbed with a rapier. The rapier has poison on the tip of it. Which one of those three, or which combination of two of those three, killed him? It is very difficult to tell. We don't want to be guilty of oversimplification.
Very closely related to that fallacy is the false dilemma, in which you're given an either-or choice.
Always beware in an argument when you're given only two polar choices. Advertisers regularly bombard us with false dilemmas. Either buy this car and be a winner, or don't and be a wimp. Either buy this deodorant and be happy and loved, or don't and have BO. Either buy this shampoo and solve dandruff and your love problems, or don't and suffer the consequences. Are these the only possibilities? Are they even likely possibilities?
A false dilemma handed to Americans during the Vietnam War was, well, would you rather fight them in Vietnam today or fight them in San Francisco tomorrow? Clearly, these were not the only choices, but that was a false dilemma handed to Americans during the Vietnam War. If in an argument you're handed an either-or choice, beware of it and see if there are not some other possibilities. Very closely related to the oversimplifying the cause of a problem is getting the cause simply wrong. As we mentioned in our example earlier about the radio beams in Germany that could supposedly stop engines. This fallacy is known as the fallacy of false cause and effect. In Latin, post hoc ergo propter hoc, or after this, therefore because of this. When two events happen close together, we tend to make the first event the cause of the second event. George Bush was elected president, and the Berlin Wall was knocked down shortly afterward. Did Bush cause the wall to fall? Jimmy Carter was elected, and we had very high inflation. Did Carter cause the inflation? If you have a headache and take a painkiller and the pain goes away, how can you ever really know it was the painkiller that took the pain away? For many effects, the cause is difficult to pin down, and so we look at an event that preceded the effect as being the cause. Statistics can be a very effective way to mislead and distort the truth. A famous essay is entitled, "How to Lie with Statistics." Two of the most misleading statistics will often be averages and percentages, especially if we do not know the whole numbers. A few years ago, Mad Magazine had an article entitled Understanding Statistics, and in that particular article they showed how averages and percentages can be misleading. They talked about in that article how the attendance at a movie increased dramatically, how it doubled in 1 week, how it increased by 100%. And in reality, what happened was that in 1 week, there were 2 bored spectators. The following week, there were 4 bored spectators for that film. Whenever you come to the city of Key West, you're going to have pressure put on you by all your friends who've ever been here before to visit one of its most famous landmarks, which is this bar here known as Hemingway's Bar, Sloppy Joe's. And that kind of pressure that you're getting on you to come to Sloppy Joe's if you come to Key West is basically what's known as bandwagon. Everybody does it. It must be great. You better take part in it. You better not be on the outside looking in. You better participate. Otherwise, you won't be part of these beautiful people that are inside having so much fun. Now, I'm standing out here on the street at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and Sloppy Joe's is already fairly crowded. Tonight, around 9 o'clock, you will have to almost stir people with a stick to have any progress up and down this street. And once again, if you don't take part in Sloppy Joe's, you're going to be on the outside looking in. Bandwagon propaganda is extraordinarily powerful because it operates on that basic idea that you're going to be left out, you're going to be lonely, you're going to be unloved, and furthermore, that because everybody's doing it, it must be right. I'm standing here in front of the Café des Artistes in Key West, Florida, and there's probably a reason why the proprietors would want to call this place the Café des Artistes restaurant. And the reason is basically associated with the idea of transfer propaganda. You see, in transfer propaganda, either positive or negative associations are made between one institution and another. And the association with things that are French is high quality, very, very sophisticated, whether it's perfume, whether it's clothing, whether it is food, wine. French have a reputation for being the very best in the world and paying the most attention to this sort of thing. So we don't know who the chef is here inside the Café des Artistes. To relate that, let me give you an example. I once ate at a Chinese restaurant and thought that the food was just rather average, so as I was leaving that restaurant, I stopped in at the kitchen and saw an Anglo hippie with a ponytail cooking back there amongst the woks. We don't know who cooks amongst the Café des Artistes, but the name choice is probably deliberate because of transfer propaganda. Why, for example, does this home security system call itself NASA? Why does Sloppy Joe's Bar in Key West make constant references to Hemingway? Why does this laundry use this presidential name? Why does this business call itself a hospital? Why did Richard Nixon have a bust of Abraham Lincoln on his desk during his Watergate TV broadcasts? A false analogy occurs when two different items or events are compared. Unfortunately, what happened in situation A may not happen again in situation B, because situations A and B are seldom totally alike. George Bush compared Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait with Adolf Hitler's taking over Czechoslovakia as proof of the terrible threat that Iraq posed to the world. But obviously, Germany and Iraq are quite dissimilar countries in wealth, population, industry, geography, and so forth. Fundamentalist preachers love to argue about the condition of America and what's going to happen to America by looking, for example, at the decadence of ancient Rome. But how similar are ancient Rome and modern America? The more similar the two parties are that are part of the analogy, the more likely it is that the analogy will be useful for purposes of argumentation. A popular analogy today involves the comparing of the war on drugs, which many people see as unsuccessful, with the unsuccessful war against illegal alcohol in the 1920s. The more similar the two institutions or the two parties to the analogy are, the more useful that analogy will be for purposes of illustration. One frequently comes across examples of a fallacy called the slippery slope in the editorials of public newspapers. The idea in the slippery slope is that if one small action is permitted, it will be the beginning of a downward spiral toward utter chaos and disaster. The National Rifle Association has long held that any attempt to regulate the ownership of handguns in the United States will inevitably lead toward the total banning of gun ownership in the United States. But sawed-off shotguns and Tommy guns have been banned from private ownership in the United States since the 1930s, and according to the latest information, there's still a great many guns afloat in America. Opponents of national health care say this will inevitably lead towards a total socialistic system of government in America in which the government controls every aspect of our lives. But we've had Social Security and we've had Medicare for a long, long time. And according to the latest results, as far as I can tell, the government doesn't have a great deal of control over its citizens in the United States at all. Those are both examples of the slippery slope fallacy. Begging the question and circular argument are very closely related terms to describe a fallacy that might be described as an opinion disguised as a fact. Look at this example. Poor people are poor because they're lazy. If they weren't lazy, they wouldn't be poor. Clearly, we're like a dog running in circles here, chasing its tail. And we haven't proven any relationship between laziness and poverty. It begs to be proven. If you read the letters on the editorial page, you can find this fallacy just about every day of the week, as writers regularly make statements of opinion that are only that, opinions, as though they were facts. We've looked at a large number of critical fallacies in this particular program. You know, P.T. Barnum once said there's a sucker born every minute. And if we are better prepared to recognize the kinds of fallacies and logic that exist in the marketplace of ideas, the better armed we are against being suckers, the better armed we are against the propagandists. If nothing else, I hope that this tape has taught you that truth is indeed a slippery rascal.